All right, let's jump right in. We're going to unpack a pretty startling legal argument today. The idea that for 40 straight years, the United States was governed under a state of emergency that, well, it might not have had any constitutional basis at all. So let's dig into this.
So it all kicks off with this. This is a jaw-dropping line from a 1973 U.S. Senate report. For 40 years, the country was officially in a declared state of national emergency. Not for a few months, not a couple of years, we're talking 4 decades. You gotta ask, how on earth did that happen? And maybe more importantly, was it even legal?
And that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? If we really want to get to the bottom of this, we have to go to the source code, the foundational document for all American law, the Constitution itself. What does that rulebook actually say about putting the country in an emergency state for decades on end? Let's find out.
To really understand this 40-year emergency, you have to see how it all got started. And for that, we need to rewind the clock, way back to the Great Depression and what has to be one of the most chaotic days in the history of Congress.
Just look at the speed of this. I mean, it's wild. According to the actual congressional record, the bill that started this whole thing was jammed through Congress in less than 2 hours. Debate was capped at 40 minutes, and the source material claims that most members of Congress voted on a bill they literally had not read. This act was the starting pistol for everything that came after.
And here is the real kicker. The Senate's own report, all those decades later, looked back on this period and concluded that this emergency state allowed the government to operate outside of the usual constitutional rules. That is a heavy and, frankly, pretty alarming statement to be coming from Congress about itself.
Okay, so if the government itself admits it was operating without reference to normal constitutional processes, the next logical thing to do is check the rulebook, right? Let's look directly inside the Constitution and see if it even allows for this kind of emergency override in the first place.
And this right here is the absolute core of the source's entire argument. When you actually search the Constitution for some kind of general emergency power clause, you find nothing. It's just not there. The document is incredibly specific. It says only one right can be suspended, habeas corpus, and only in the most extreme cases, like a rebellion or an invasion. That is it.
So let's break down what this legal analysis is really saying. Point 1, there's no off switch for the Constitution. Nothing in the text says you can just pause it. Point 2, no power is given to the president or to Congress or to the courts to just ignore the rules during a crisis. And point 3, just look at the absolute language of the First Amendment. Congress shall make no law. The source's argument is that no means no. There are no secret exceptions for emergencies.
Okay, so if the Constitution doesn't grant these huge emergency powers, then what does it say about who has the final authority? This gets us to the fundamental pecking order, the hierarchy of law in the United States.
The source lays out this really clear pyramid of power. At the absolute top, the peak is the Constitution. Article 6 even calls it the supreme law of the land. Below that, you've got Congress, but it only has the specific, limited powers listed in Article 1. And then the 10th Amendment nails it all down. Any power that wasn't given to the federal government is kept by the states or by the people themselves. It's a pretty clear structure.
And listen, this isn't some new radical idea. This exact principle was carved into stone way back in 1803 in the landmark Supreme Court case Marbury v. Madison. The ruling is simple, and it's absolute. If Congress passes a law that goes against the Constitution, that law is void. It's legally meaningless. The Constitution always wins. And it's not just Congress that's kept on a leash. In another huge case from 1952, Justice Robert Jackson wrote that a president's power is at its absolute weakest. He called it its lowest ebb when their actions go against the Constitution. This just hammers home the point that nobody, not a president, not Congress, is above the supreme law of the land.
So, we've looked at the history, we've searched the Constitution itself, and we've reviewed the major legal precedents. Now we can finally put all of these pieces together and see the ultimate conclusion that this source material is really forced to make.
So let's just lay this out with simple logic, exactly how the source does. First premise, the if statement. Every single thing the government does has to be rooted in some authority given to it by the Constitution. That's the bedrock.
Okay, and here's the and statement. As we just saw, this analysis couldn't find any clause, any sentence, anywhere in the Constitution that gives the government the power to declare a permanent state of emergency or suspend the normal rules. That power just isn't in the text.
So then, the conclusion is just unavoidable.
If an action needs constitutional authority and that authority doesn't exist, then that action is, by its very definition, unconstitutional. It's a straight line of logic based on all the evidence we just walked through.
The source even has a specific term for this, extra-constitutional, and basically means operating outside the lines, playing by a different set of rules that aren't in the official rulebook. So when that 1973 Senate report said the government acted without reference to normal constitutional processes, this analysis argues that what they were really admitting to was taking extra-constitutional action.
And that brings us to the final, sweeping conclusion of this legal analysis. The entire emergency system, the one the Senate itself said lasted for 40 years, was operating without a constitutional leg to stand on. It was an authority, this source claims, that the government simply invented for itself.
You know, this whole thing really forces us to wrestle with a massive, timeless question. When we're faced with a real crisis, a true emergency, where do you draw that line? Where does the need for safety end and the need to follow the absolute rule of law begin? That tension is at the very heart of this debate, and it's definitely something worth thinking about.